Good afternoon. This is Allison Pena with Worldwide ERC. Thanks to everyone for connecting and welcome to today's webinar program, How Do You Want Your Brexit? Hard, Soft, or Scrambled? Sponsored by Altair Global. Before we begin, please take a moment to review Worldwide ERC's webinar disclaimer. And now I would like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. If you are experiencing technical difficulties joining the WebEx session today, please dial 866-779-3239 from the U.S. Email questions may be sent to support@webex.com. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you have a question during the presentation, you may submit it online at any time. To submit your question, please use the Q&A tab located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Simply click on the tab and type your question into the dialog box at the bottom of the screen and then click the Send button. Please note that all written questions selected during this webinar will be answered publicly. We do expect a high volume of questions and will attempt to answer as many as possible. Lastly, a link to this handout will be included in an email scheduled to go out later this afternoon. Please be on the lookout for it. It will come to you from messenger@webex.com. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 CRP International and 1 GMS credit. If you hold your CRP designation and would like to receive credit for this webinar, you will need to use the CRP Credits Management Portal, which may be linked to from your profile page after logging into the Worldwide ERC website. The seminar ID for today's session is 15638. If you are a GMS seeking CE credit for this webinar, you must include the name and date of this program on your GMS renewal application at the time you apply for recertification. The renewal application is available online. HRCI information is noted on this slide for the live event only. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Ben Sheldrick is Managing Partner and Head of Business Immigration at McGrath LLP Solicitors. He is also a Director of McGrath Global, Singapore, which caters to an extensive corporate client base in the Asia-Pacific region. He has been recognized for many years as a leading UK immigration expert by the legal community, and he is ranked for his expertise in immigration law by the main professional directories, Legal 500 and Chambers and Partners. He also appears in Legal Experts, published by Legal Business, and he is rated by super lawyers and global law experts. Vice President Simon Scott supports Altair Global's business objectives with projects designed to improve efficiency and ensure their clients continue to benefit from the best suppliers supporting globally mobile employees. His responsibilities include finance, pricing, and supply chain management. Simon has worked in a variety of industries as a management accountant before entering the global relocation industry 13 years ago. Since then, he has held a myriad of roles in global mobility, including managing the global supply chain for a large relocation management company and destination services business across 44 countries. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Simon.
Was ratified by the EU last week. The transition period, what effects we can expect from Brexit for UK business, what business practices you can put into effect to deal with the potential fallout from Brexit, and then we'll talk about some hot topics. And then I'll hand over to Ben to cover off some of the immigration issues and questions. And then we'll talk just briefly about some of the broader consequences of no deal.
I think to your first point, Simon, about where we are currently, I think we're in a bit of a mess, aren't we? Because we've got that vote next week, and it seems that Parliament is totally undecided and divided on Brexit. So it's going to be a really interesting period over the next few weeks.
It certainly will be, absolutely. But the interesting thing about Brexit is that the origins of Brexit actually go back far before the actual referendum itself. So you could look at the UK as being somewhat of an unwilling partner when it comes to the EU project. And if you look back right to the very beginnings of when the UK joined the EU, there were, in fact, a number of wranglings over the terms on which the UK should enter the EU. And the referendum itself was actually designed to be, in some eyes, was designed to be a way of curing the rifts within the Conservative Party, one of the major political parties in the UK, which has traditionally had those that were pro-EU and those who were against the EU. So the referendum was held on June 23rd, 2016. I think it's fair to say that most people did not expect the vote to be one taking the UK out of the EU.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a bit like the Trump result in America.
Yes, very much so. So as you can see, 51.9% to 48.1%. Very high turnout, 71.8%. That's higher than some general elections in the UK. And there were a number of, one of the advantages that the Leave camp had was that they had a number of very emotive subjects on which to hang their campaign. One of which was UK immigration, and another was sovereignty over the UK had to take back its sovereignty. One of the interesting things is if you look at opinion polls within the UK over the last sort of 10 to 15 years and asked them, the UK population was asked what were the most important issues for them at that particular point in time. And prior to the referendum, the European Union and Europe in general often really didn't appear any higher than about 10 or 11. And then all of a sudden, with the referendum, it jumps up to around sort of 5 or 4, and immigration becomes a much higher factor. I think
there's no doubt. I think that they played the immigration card very hard, didn't they, in the referendum campaign, and that obviously resonated with the public. Whether it was justified or not is a completely, separate question.
Yes, absolutely. I think the other interesting is if you look at the context of the referendum, it's against a background of a rise of populism across the EU. So there are a number of countries where similar concerns about membership of the EU are being sort of raised, and that's one of the reasons why the EU are playing hardball with the UK, because if they don't make it very difficult for the UK to leave, then they may have other countries deciding they want to do the same thing. And I think you can even look to the US and the rise of Donald Trump again as being another indicator of this sort of rise of populism across the globe. And so we will be leaving officially on the 11th, or on 11 p.m. on March 29th, 2019. That's if we can actually get anybody to agree how this is going to work.
We'll either be moving into a transition period, which is the preferred option, I think, for everybody, or there'll be a sort of a cliff edge, hard Brexit scenario the following day, which is really not in the interest of the country, I don't think.
Yeah. So at the moment, we have a withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement was created through negotiation between the UK government and the EU. It was ratified by the EU last week, but it must be agreed by the UK Parliament in a vote which is due to take place next week. As it stands currently, it is highly likely that withdrawal agreement will be rejected by Parliament, basically for the reasons that it is trying to please both those that would choose to remain and those that would choose to leave, and is actually not pleasing anybody by trying to do so. So we are likely to be left with a limbo situation. There is also the second document, which is a future political declaration. It's very much a wish list, an idea of what might happen or what we'd like to happen, but it's not legally binding, and it really doesn't have much bearing at the moment in terms of what's going to happen. At the moment, really, it's all about withdrawal agreement, and it's all about what happens if that doesn't get ratified by the UK Parliament next week.
Yeah, and I think that's the big concern, isn't it, of a lot of members of Parliament, is that we have this withdrawal agreement that is legally binding and contains some provisions that could keep us attached to the EU for a long period, but we've got this sort of flimsy political declaration that is really just a statement of intent and doesn't legally bind anybody.
Yeah, so that's so that's where we're at right now. So we've really got a choice next week. If the UK government doesn't ratify it, they can try again. But the EU has already made it clear that they're not prepared to renegotiate. This is really the deal that's on the table, and they're not going to negotiate any amendment to that deal. Uh, so that leaves us really with two choices. Do we go for a no deal, which is a very scary place to be? It means we would be trying to trade on WTO rules, but those arrangements would be a fallback position. But the intention or the hope would be to try and negotiate new trade deals with any number of countries, but obviously those will take many years to do. There are also a whole load of EU bodies in institutions that the UK is member of, which would our membership of those institutions would cease to exist. So to give you a very clear example, at the moment we have an agreement with the EU that allows flights taking off from the UK to cross the EU. If there is a no deal and we go for a hard Brexit, flights out of the UK could potentially not be allowed to cross Europe, which would be a bit of a problem.
Bit of a disaster. Yeah, I think a lot will depend on how heavy. Let's assume there is a defeat in Parliament next week. How heavy that defeat is, because if it's a major defeat in terms of the numbers for Theresa May, you could foresee a situation where she feels compelled to resign as Prime Minister, and then we're left in limbo, electing a new leader of the Conservative Party over a sort of 5-6 weeks period before we actually know what happens next.
And I think Ben's highlighted exactly the issue we're facing right now, and why businesses are struggling to cope with this situation, because there's such a degree of uncertainty right now. We may find that we end up with a second public referendum. This is an idea which is gaining a lot of ground right now, and a lot of the opinion polls are now showing that more people would be choosing to remain in the EU than they would to leave, particularly given that the UK government published some statistics last week which showed that there is no version of Brexit which would leave the UK better off than remaining within the EU. So it's for a lot of people now, they're feeling that this has been such a mess that actually we would have been better off staying within the EU in the first place.
It's a trade-off, isn't it? Because I think they're saying that economically we may be slightly less well off, but if the country as a whole is so committed to regaining sovereignty and control of immigration, then that may be the price we have to pay.
We shall see. Yes, who knows? So just to go through the withdrawal agreement, because as it stands right now, the withdrawal agreement is the deal on the table. So the main provisions are that the UK would cease to be a member of the EU institutions, but there would be agreements in place in an interim period to allow us to remain within those. We would preserve frictionless trade between the UK and the EU. There would be an agreement to the divorce bill. Now, the divorce bill is basically the agreement as to how much money the UK would pay the EU. This is predominantly to cover things like pensions of those UK citizens that have worked within EU institutions, and also to cover things such as infrastructure projects that were agreed within the EU at the time that the UK was a member, and that the EU therefore feels that until those have been completed and paid for, then the UK should be prepared to pay for those.
I think the bill is something in the region of £40 billion, as I understand it.
Yes, I think it's around 40 to 50 billion. So it's a sizable amount of money. There are some citizen rights to be established. This is EU citizens living within the UK and UK citizens living within the EU. Fishing rights, something which has been a very hot topic. And a 2-year transition timeline. So this takes us to the end of 2020 and would basically allow us to put in place things that could be to basically take us beyond 2020. But the free movement of people will end, and that's really rather critical, because that was such a big part of why people chose for the UK to leave. Now, some of the concerns. So the UK will still have to abide by the rules of the EU institutions until the end of transition. and laws and disputes will be overseen by the European Court of Justice. Again, this is a major problem for a lot of the people that really were fervently in favour of the UK leaving. So to have that, the ECJ still covering the UK laws is a major issue for them.
I think there's also a big concern that within the withdrawal agreement, or even though it provides for a 2-year transition, there is scope for that to be extended, I think, for up to another 2 years, in the event that there isn't an agreement on future trade, etc. So potentially we would see ourselves covered by the ECJ for a further 4-year period, and the people who voted for Brexit and the hardline Brexiteers in Parliament really don't like that.
Yeah. The Irish backstop. Now, this has been the fundamental flaw in all arrangements that, in terms of the negotiations. You have to bear in mind that the island of Ireland is split into two. The Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and then you have the Irish Republic. Currently, there is no border between, no hard border. So traffic can drive between the north and the south, and vice versa, without any delay, without any being stopped at the border. Now, that can't continue if the UK leaves the EU. There would need to be some kind of arrangement by which goods and services would be dealt with at the border. People moving across the border would need to be dealt with, and the problem we have is that the UK government has made it clear that they will not create a hard border.
Yeah.
But
also, what's important in that context is the fact that the withdrawal agreement specifically refers to what's known as the Belfast Agreement from 1998, which talks about maintaining the peace on the island of Ireland. Obviously, there's a long, very complicated history of political division in Ireland, and the Belfast Agreement actually prohibits there being a hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So you're completely right. There's this conflict between what ostensibly would need to be in place for if we're outside the EU and we need a border, conflict between that and the scenario in terms of preserving peace in Northern Ireland.
And one of the suggestions was that actually we move the border to between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, but that is a situation which the majority of those in Northern Ireland would refuse to have. And in fact, the Theresa May Conservative government is currently being propped up by 10 Northern Ireland MPs who would vote against that. So this is a whole area where it's very difficult to see how this can get pushed through and resolved.
Yeah.
We then have then the final thing is that the UK can negotiate trade deals with other countries, but cannot implement them until the question of trade with the rest of the EU has been finalised. So this is a particularly tricky area for us.
Is it right that we can come to a full agreement on a future trade arrangement, let's say with the USA, have the document ready to sign, but we can't implement it until we're out of this transitional period, and that could be for up to 4 years.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a real problem. So let's just move on. So the transition period, we've got the key aspects are, as mentioned, this runs to the end of 2020. It may be extended for up to 2 years, but would have to have an agreement from a minimum of 20 EU countries for it to do so, and the UK would have to pay the EU 10 billion euros a year in order to allow that to happen. The free movement of people will continue unchanged during the transition, and the UK will remain part of the customs union, i.e. goods and services will be able to flow freely between the UK and the EU. And as mentioned earlier, we'll be able to negotiate new trade agreements, but we will not be allowed to implement them. What effects are we seeing then in respect of Brexit? This is a real issue right now. So we've got a lot of companies are preparing, but really not enough. But we're saying that 34% have confirmed or stated their intention to move some or all of their operations or staff from the UK to Europe. So just today, for instance, Bank of America announced that they would be moving 125 jobs from the UK to the rest of Europe, predominantly Dublin. And Dublin has been doing exceptionally well from Brexit, with jobs moving from UK to the Irish Republic. But we are seeing any number of different professions being impacted. So to give you an example, architects from the UK that want to work anywhere in Europe, currently they would have their qualifications recognised by relevant European bodies, but post the transition period that will not be the case, and they would have to probably do some kind of course to transition their qualification to that of a local body. And this is being felt right away across any number of professional service sectors. So what kind of things could your business do to proactively manage these risks? So the first would be really to identify your personnel. So look at how many EU and non-EU personnel are employed by your company, and make a distinction between British and other EU. This will help you understand what the potential impacts are likely to be, depending on where those people are working. Similarly, look at your supply chain and your workforce planning to determine dependency on continental EU labour. This is a major issue right now for a lot of businesses. Just last week, one of the large hotel chains announced that they may have to close down a number of hotels within the UK because they can't actually employ enough staff to make their hotels operate, because they're traditionally reliant on EU labour, and a lot of that EU labour is going back.
That's a really interesting point. Certainly, from being in London, if you you go out into the hospitality industry here in London, there are so many jobs are taken by EU migrants, young citizens from across the EU take jobs in bars and restaurants and shops, etc. And also, the construction industry is extremely dependent on EU labour. So it's all very well to say, you know, we want to have control of immigration, but there's a clear argument for maintaining a flow of labour from overseas.
Yeah, it's definitely quite scary. I mean, one of the sort of most highlighted examples was that currently most of the soft fruit crop in the UK is picked by EU nationals, and there were great fears that we would have entire fields of rotting fruit because there'd be nobody to pick them. And in fact, we have seen this year exactly that, where the number of people that were required to pick fruit was not met because there were fewer people from the EU.
So the harvests weren't actually properly harvested, as it were.
No, that's it, exactly. And then one of the other points you can think about is to look at where your businesses are located. So what we're seeing a lot of now is businesses are they're setting up offices in both the UK and in another European country to make sure they have that footprint. So if you look at companies such as EasyJet, which is one of the low budget carriers in Europe, they've traditionally been headquartered in the UK, but they've now moved one of their headquarters to Austria so that they have a foot in either camp.
So what do you think is going to happen in the event of a non-agreement, a no deal? Well, presumably businesses will have to, come the end of this year, beginning of January, really expedite their thinking in terms of their strategy for this scenario.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is that a lot of businesses at the moment are waiting to see what's going to happen, but because nobody really wants to spend the money to mitigate these risks if they can avoid it. And so now, given that we've got the transition period, we have a little bit of time potentially to deal with some of these things. But if we go hard Brexit, who knows? It could be rather scary. And then the final method of managing the risk is really just develop a communication strategy and plan. Everybody needs to know how this is likely to affect your business, and in particularly within our industry, mobility, there are probably people who you may have working in the UK right now. Maybe they're EU citizens who may be concerned about what are their rights going to be when the UK leaves the EU. So again, thinking about how that might play out, it could be something of value to your business. Hot topics. As mentioned, agriculture and hospitality are two areas where there's some particular issue. But as Ben mentioned, areas such as engineering as well. Trying professional people coming from the EU who are fulfilling roles. Another one, the National Health Service within the UK is highly reliant on doctors and nurses from across the EU, and there's some serious shortages. I think the NHS is now something like 10% of all roles are left unfulfilled right now.
Really?
So that's a major problem. Yeah. So I know this is something Ben will cover, but EU nationals currently the plan is to give them a right to reside. But currently, if we did end up going a hard Brexit, potentially they would lose that right to reside, and that's a major concern for a lot of EU nationals, which explains why so many are currently leaving. There are some issues as well around the cost of housing and school places. So what we have seen over the last sort of 10 years or so is that the cost of housing has increased, and there's been increasing shortage of school places. This has largely been put down to EU nationals coming into the UK. However, there is also just a general rising population anyway. One of the big uncertainties is exactly what's going to happen with the cost of housing post-Brexit. There is a real fear that house prices will in fact crash. Some of the figures that are being thrown around at the moment are something like a 30% drop in the value of housing in the UK. So that's going to create an interesting effect. It may very well be that a lot of people might now be starting to try and sell houses before the exit. And in fact, what we are seeing is that we've just had recently a number of assignees who had agreed to take a house for rent, only to find that the landlord had decided to sell, for fear of the concerns around falling house prices.
If there was a fall of that kind, it would cause a significant economic recession, wouldn't it? Because you'd have a lot of people moving into negative equity scenarios in their properties.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's quite a concern. And then we have areas such as social security coverage, certificates of coverage. What are those going to be? There's going to be okay going forward. Creditworthiness is a really interesting one. So some banks in the UK are now refusing to loan money to EU nationals for fear that we may be going for a hard Brexit, and therefore their position is going to be is uncertain. So they won't lend the money, which is a real concern for those people. And then the final one is currently within the EU there is something called an EHIC, which is it's a European-wide social healthcare. So if I, as a UK citizen, go to a EU country and I fall ill, that country has to provide me with health coverage, and it's a cross-Europe scheme. If the UK comes crashing out of the EU, then that will not be the case. Okay, so now I'm going to pass over to Ben, who's going to cover off the immigration aspects.
Oh, yes, thanks very much. So in terms of immigration, obviously, as you've already mentioned, Simon, we currently have a position where EU nationals have what's called a right of free movement under EU law, and that basically does what it says on the tin. It means that nationals from member states of the European Union, or the European Economic Area as we also refer to the relationship, have an entitlement to cross borders and to live in any other member state of the Union. Under the single market, there are four freedoms, the four famous pillars of the single market are the free movement of goods, services, capital and people, and certainly the EU's position is that they are indivisible, so the UK couldn't unilaterally exclude itself from the freedom of movement of people because of the debate on immigration without excluding itself from the other elements of that particular jigsaw. In terms of the movement of people, EU nationals have an entitlement currently to move to work, to study, to be self-employed or self-sufficient. So that's a pretty wide range of options for EU nationals to move freely across borders. And in terms of the border itself, it's what I would call a light touch border, in that an individual, let's say coming to London from Italy, simply has to show that he or she is Italian and has an Italian passport, and that person will be admitted freely. And normally that's done on a through a biometric machine these days anyway. So there's no system for EU nationals to be examined by immigration officers, as is the situation that applies to everybody else from the rest of the world coming into the UK. So if you fly into London, there's basically two queues. There's the queue on the left-hand side, which is for British people and for EU nationals who can enter freely, and then on the other side for everybody else who has to explain why they're here, or present a visa or a residence permit, or seek permission to come in under the immigration rules. So it's a far more complicated process, far more criteria that apply. Now, when we leave the European Union, theoretically, all the EU citizens who used to come in freely would have to go into the other queue and present themselves through immigration. That's not realistic as an outcome because there's so much traffic into the airports in the UK. So there'll have to be a continuation in some form of a light touch border enabling EU citizens to travel through, but clearly there won't be freedom of movement as such, and there will be criteria that apply to them staying here over the long term. If we look at my next slide, which talks about the status quo for free movement of EU nationals, there's a simple check at the moment for legal right to work that applies equally to EU citizens as to British citizens. In other words, if you're an employer and you identify somebody for a role and that person is, say, Greek or Spanish, you simply have to see evidence that they are Greek or Spanish in the form of their passport, just as you would for a British citizen. So there's an entitlement to work, no work permits required, there's no process of applying to the authorities for permission to employ. And more than that, EU nationals have a right to family life and to reunion with family members. So that means, for example, that if you're a French national in the UK and you're married to an American, or you're married to an Australian or a Russian or a Chinese person, or wherever that spouse may come from, that spouse has an entitlement to join you in the UK through rights that accrue from the EU treaties, and that's not within the British domestic law. It actually accrues from the overarching EU law. And any EU citizen who's in the UK, or indeed in any member state, for a period of up to 5 years can apply for permanent residence. So if you exercise a treaty right, let's say as a worker or as a student or as a self-sufficient person for a 5-year period, you can make an application and obtain permanent residence here and stay obviously indefinitely, and in due course apply for British citizenship. For the rest of the world, on the next slide, you can see that the situation is slightly different. There are immigration rules that apply to people coming in from around the world, and there are criteria that have to be met, and individuals should meet criteria normally according to a tier system. You see that there are 5 tiers there on the slide. It's a points-based system currently. So under one of the points-based system, investors and entrepreneurs from overseas, that's high net worth individuals or innovative and entrepreneurial people, can come in and invest money in the UK. Investors can invest £2 million in passive investments and stay in the UK simply on the basis that they've invested in the UK economy. Entrepreneurs must invest at least £200,000 in a UK business, and they're under an obligation to also create employment for settled workers here in the UK. For employers and for big businesses, the most relevant scheme is the Tier 2 scheme, which enables employers to sponsor foreign nationals, either as intra-company transferees if they've been employed by a business overseas for a period of at least 12 months and they're being transferred into the UK. They can be transferred and obtain what we call a certificate of sponsorship. But that's for a maximum period of 5 years. So that's your sort of typical long-term assignment scenario. So anything up to 5 years can be covered by an intra-company transfer, but it has to be a skilled role that's from a list of acceptable skilled roles published by our UK authority, which is the Home Office. And the role has to be paid at a specific rate, and the person can only work for that particular employer. Whereas, as you know, under freedom of movement, an EU national can take any form of employment. For Tier 2 general situations, employers can take somebody on the long-term or on a permanent basis, but there's a resident labour market test that applies. In other words, employers have to show a genuine attempt to recruit from within the resident labour market before they can assign what we call certificates of sponsorship. Tier 3 has never been opened, actually. That's the low-skilled migration route, and the reason why that hasn't been opened under the points-based system in the UK is because it's considered that we do have sufficient numbers of people coming in to the UK from the EU 27 at the moment to take those roles. And Simon, you talked about those roles just now with hospitality and construction, etc. I guess it follows that we may need to open Tier 3 in the future once we've left the EU in order to attract less skilled workers from outside the EU as well as from the EU.
Do you get any sense that that's what they're going to do?
Well, actually, no. I think what Theresa May has spoken about and what the Home Secretary has spoken about is a real focus on skilled migration under the future immigration regime. The government is due to publish what we call a white paper, which is a policy document on future immigration policy that was meant to come out this week, but I understand that the Cabinet hasn't been able to agree the contents, so it won't be out before the vote next week, but it is imminent. But certainly it's likely that the focus will be on skilled migration, but there will have to be a solution to low-skilled migration as well, whether that's for young people to come on a temporary basis, say for up to 2 years to work, but clearly the concerns of industry will have to be listened to. Tier 5, incidentally, is for temporary workers. So currently there are various schemes for young people from countries outside the EU to come here and to work for up to 2 years, as long as there's a reciprocal arrangement between that country and the UK. And I do anticipate that will be expanded in the future. And there are all sorts of other rules in the UK which are far too detailed and complex to go into now. But for example, there are domestic immigration rules for family members, so spouses and partners, children, etc. But the rules curiously, under domestic immigration law, are more onerous and more complicated than the simple freedom of movement provisions that are provided for under EU law. Just looking at the next.
Sorry, just going to ask a question, Ben. Do you expect that on the Tier 2, do you expect that some of those, like for instance, would the quota go up, or do you think some of the rules will get relaxed? Because obviously we've been drawing from a big pool of European skills base, which we're now going to be a bit closed to. So how do you think that's going to cope?
Probably right. I think that's probably right. I think that the quota certainly that you mentioned. So currently under Tier 2, there's a quota which means that only 20,700 certificates of sponsorship, for example, under Tier 2 General can be assigned on an annual basis, and that quota will have to go up. There's also talk about actually getting rid of the resident labour market test that I mentioned, so that salary would be the key determinant feature as to whether a person could be sponsored. So if an employer takes the view that they need somebody from overseas and they're prepared to pay them at the appropriate rate, then there may be in the future exemptions to the resident labour market test. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if we get rid of freedom of movement and we maintain the Tier 2 system as it's currently designed, then there simply won't be the flow of skilled labour that we will need in this country. So there will have to be some flexing in that scheme, I'm quite sure. Actually, if to that point, if we look at the next slide, the overarching government policy since 2010, the reason I mentioned 2010 is that's when the Conservatives came into office, initially under a coalition government, but Theresa May actually has been the architect of immigration policy here in the UK since then. She was the Home Secretary from 2010 to 2016 when she became Prime Minister, and she has been very focused on immigration policy and on this ambition to reduce net migration to below 100,000 people each year. Net migration is the difference between the number of people who enter the country from overseas on a long-term basis for a period of a year or more over the course of a year, and those who leave. So the balance is the surplus population that occurs when you take into account people coming and going. And her ambition has always been to reduce it to below 100,000 a year, but she's never achieved that. And we're now 8 years down the line since she initiated the policy. So, for example, in the year to June 2017, net migration was at 230, so well above the target, albeit slightly down on the same period for the previous year. The reason why it's down is that since the referendum took place in June 2016, there has certainly been a downturn in the number of EU nationals coming to the UK, presumably because well, emotionally they may feel less welcome because the referendum result is perceived as something of an insult to the EU, but also perhaps more importantly the fact that the political and long-term situation here is uncertain for EU nationals, and so there's been less motivation to come here. And you can see in March 2018 net migration was still at around 271,000. So that target's never been reached. Whether it's a desirable target or not is another question. And then, as I mentioned already, we have this quota on Tier 2, 21,700. Because we've seen a downturn in migration from the EU, you've actually seen an uptick in demand for sponsorship of people from outside the EU, and that's clearly driven by industry needs to bring in skilled people from overseas. So I don't think simply leaving the EU actually solves an immigration problem as such, if there is one.
If there was ever a problem in the first place.
If there was a problem in the first place. For the EU nationals who are already here in the UK or coming into the UK, we've got a little slide on the next page which shows in a form that's hopefully easy to understand that we have three tranches, if you like, of this Brexit process for the purpose of immigration. So let's assume that we do come to an agreement that is ratified. We do leave the EU legally on the 29th of March next year, but because of the transition arrangement that is contained within the withdrawal agreement, there follows an implementation period up to the 31st of December 2020, and during that time free movement rights are preserved, so EU nationals will be able to continue coming under the free movement rights until the end of 2020, and they'll be able to stay beyond that. As I mentioned previously, if you're in the UK for a 5-year period, you can apply for permanent residence, and the government is introducing or has introduced on a test basis and is rolling out in the new year universally a scheme called settlement status, which means that any EU national in the UK can apply for either settled status if they've been here for 5 years, that's permanent residence, or pre-settled status if they haven't been here for 5 years, and that will give them permission to stay for 5 years, at which point they can apply for settled status. So regardless of Brexit, and also regardless of the ultimate Brexit date of 31st of December 2020, EU citizens coming into the UK will be able to stay for up to 5 years and obtain permanent residence. So even if that person comes in on the 31st of December 2020 and starts work, he or she will be able to stay for up to 5 years and apply for settled status. The new immigration scheme, assuming we do have this transition, will come into force in 2021. and that, of course, is assuming the transition doesn't get extended, but this is the current plan, will come into force in 2021. What it will look like, we don't know, but the idea behind this settled and pre-settled settlement and pre-settlement scheme is that it preserves the rights of EU nationals, certainly over the course of the next 2 years, and it preserves the rights of those who are living here currently, and is designed to alleviate concerns, of which there are obviously many, in respect of EU national rights. And also in the transitional or in the withdrawal agreement, there is provision for the same scenario for UK citizens residing across EU 27.
And I guess if we go for hard Brexit, there's a real concern about what does that do to the rights of EU nationals living in the UK, and what does the UK government do with them?
Yeah, I mean, it really does. The fact is that Theresa May is on record as saying that she will honour her commitment to preserve settled status for EU nationals who are currently here. So that certainly will apply to anybody who's here up to and including the end of March of next year. But you're quite right, anybody coming in after that date, if we had a hard Brexit scenario, the position is extremely uncertain. It's also true to say, of course, that the reason why we need this implementation period is that we have 3.5 million EU nationals here in the UK, and all of those people will need to go through this process. Now, it's supposed to be an easy, online, sort of light touch process, but it's still 3.5 million people, and it's not realistic or possible for all of those people to be processed through this scheme between now and the end of March next year. The Home Office doesn't have the resources to do that. They haven't actually even universally implemented the scheme. So it's really not a possibility for that to happen. So there will have to be changes, there'll have to be arrangements made that enables this scheme to be rolled out over a longer period, regardless of whether the withdrawal agreement that's currently before Parliament is rejected. Just on the next slide, I've talked about that sort of light touch process. What EU citizens have to do is prove simply that their identity, that would be in the form of their passport, prove that they are resident here. If they wish to obtain settled status, they'll need to prove that they've been resident here for a 5-year period. They will self-certify that they don't have a criminal record. My assumption is that in the background a criminal record check will be undertaken, although whether the government has the capacity to actually check criminal records across the world, I doubt very much. There's an element of trust, I suspect, involved in this. There's an application fee which is £65, and then, as I said, you can either obtain settled status if you've been here for 5 years, or pre-settled status if you are short of that, and that pre-settled status enables you to stay and be here for 5 years and then apply. So that hopefully is the way the scheme will roll out. But it's a big scheme to implement, and there are a lot of people involved. I think you asked about immigration policy options for the future. I've just talked about them briefly on the next slide, which is what we could see in the future in terms of immigration policy options. The policy background being what they call taking back control. That was the mantra of the referendum. The options would be the points-based system. That would make sense because that's the scheme that we already have for non-EU nationals. Certainly what I'm hearing from government is that there is no likelihood of a different scheme for EU citizens and the rest of the world. The idea will be to have one scheme that applies equally to people wherever they come from, regardless of their nationality. But it could be certainly based on the points-based system. But you're right, Simon, I think certainly the Tier 2 scheme will have to be developed and expanded in order to accommodate more people. Possibility of work permits for shortage occupations, so that would be particular areas of the labour market that are accepted to be insufficiently provided for from people here in the UK. The resident labour market test, as I say, that's the test that you have to undertake by advertising externally to show an attempt to recruit. There may be some aversion of that, but it may be lifted to some extent. And of course, there's the question of this free trade agreement, or whatever agreement finally comes through the negotiations that will occur over the course of the next 2 years, because it's possible that there could be some form of mobility chapter within that treaty, and that may provide for things like intracompany transfers, etc., work permits for the provision of services, etc., pursuant to the treaty. A little bit like in the US, there are mobility provisions within NAFTA. So there's scope certainly for something, but I don't think it'll be anything like the current freedom of movement provisions. I think I hand over to you here, don't I? Because we're going to talk about broader consequences of a no deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things is really, and just keeping an eye on the time now, one of the challenges really with where we're at right now is that things are changing rapidly. I've just checked onto the BBC website and noticed that there has been another development, which is that the Conservative government has now suffered 3 defeats in the House of Commons around Brexit. So the government went to their own lawyers to get legal advice on Brexit and the results of the agreements they've got in place, and had refused to publish it. And the government, the Houses of Parliament have now overturned that, and they are now being forced to publish that. So that's going to now create a whole load of more information on which people will be able to make their determination. The concern is that the government's own lawyers may in fact tell them that it's there's some legal problems with some of the parts of the agreement, which would be a problem.
That's only day 1 of the debate, by the way. We've got another 4 days. So it's going to be an interesting week.
It will be indeed. But one of the options that might be on the table, and this is looking increasingly unlikely now, it has to be said, but it's still an option, is this idea of the no deal. So this would be the UK comes crashing out of the EU without any kind of deal on the table. There are predictions of economic disaster. The UK would not have to pay the 39 billion to the EU, but there's concerns that, how does that look to the general, the wider world if the UK is reneging on its commitments? The UK would be free of EU control. It could embark upon a Singapore-style future of slashing tariffs and taxes. But there are all sorts of things that are possible from a no deal. The big issue is the UK just isn't ready for it, and the reality is that it would be a major issue for the UK and could have some very far-reaching effects in the short term.
There's a lot of talk about things like medicines not getting into the country. You mentioned flights not taking. I mean, I know those are kind of apocalyptic scenarios that may be an exaggeration, but there's a real fear that elements of the country could grind to a halt in the event of a no deal.
So we're all keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that no deal is definitely not on the table. But as to what the other options are, well, you'll have to watch it whether we get scrambled or not.
Very good. I like you brought in the egg analogy at the end.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. And if anybody has any questions, I appreciate that we're sort of running towards the end of time now. But if you have any questions, I'm sure we'll be able to follow those up.
Yes, absolutely. If you all would like to add questions into the Q&A area, I'd be happy to pass those along to Simon and Ben at a later time. But thank you very much to you both, to Simon and Ben, for sharing your insights with us today. I'd also like to offer a very special thank you to Altar Global for their sponsorship of this webinar. Please watch your emails for a copy of today's presentation. It will come to you from messenger@webex.com. Thank you all again. Have a great afternoon, and you may now disconnect.